I'd like to thank you all for coming down here today. My name is Michael Caldwell. I'm chairman of the Shankill Area Social History Group, which is known as the SAIS Group. There's a few people here today never heard of us, so I'll just give you a brief outline. About 7 years ago, there was 25 people attended a local history class. And once it was over, they decided that they should keep it going. It's now running 7 years. It's running quite successfully. We meet on a Monday morning, 10:30. Any of you are welcome to come down. You can see what it's like. You can see what you think of it. We can see what we think of you. And if you want to join, there's no problem. We're always looking at new members. I'm not going to read all 4 pages, don't panic. The SAIS has always had a Great War project plan. However, we didn't have the computer know-how or the finances to carry it out until now. A few months ago, we approached Living Legacies within Queens and asked them for help and guidance around building a website. We applied for funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund. From our first contact, Sophie, Elaine, Heather, and the rest of the Living Legacy team, they have given us a great deal of help to get everything done. The Heritage Lottery Fund, again, were very, Lorraine Robinson, were very good. We went to see them. They explained what they can get money for, how we could apply for it, and we made a few adjustments, and we were lucky enough to receive funding. So the hope is that with this funding, the legacy stuff that we have can all be kept, and everybody can access it from wherever in the world. So I would like to thank both the people at Queen's and the Heritage Lottery Fund for their help. I hope the project will be proof in payment for all that there. Everything that they gave us has let us educate ourselves as well about the Great War. We're now at a level where we'll be able to learn how to research, compile, archive and put on show within our new website all the items we get from the community. There seems to have been quite a few people come in this morning to get stuff scanned, put on their website. That's what we want. We want this to be a continual thing. It's not just now, it's in future. People will say, oh, I forgot about it last Monday. Well, you can bring it down some other day and we'll get it done again. So, over 5,000 men marched down Shankill Road. 1,500 of them never returned. That was for the First World War. There's about 120 killed on the 1st of July itself. The website will be an everlasting memorial to them all, to the dead, to the families that were left behind, and the families that are still living within the Greater Shankill today. As I just said, the website will be a memorial to all those affected by the Great War. And I would like to dedicate the project we're about to carry to those SAIS members who are no longer with us. Members Sandra Yates, Tommy Clark, Norman Hunt, and Albert Hazlitt were all good members of the group, and it's only right that they be recognised here today. Thank you. I would now ask Richard Grayson to give us a talk on the West Belfast Ulster Volunteer Force, 1913 to 1918.
First of all, I just wanted to follow on from the comments made just now about the Great War Project. It's a really tremendous initiative by SAIS. Johnny in particular has been leading the way in this for probably a decade now, I should think, in gathering photo material from the newspapers once held in Belfast City Library, but I think no longer accessible in lots of ways. So he's been an important archivist himself, and there have been many occasions when I've been trying to find out about men from this part of the city who served, and I know that Johnny probably has the information in his photograph database, and he's provided that with me, and it's been really good working with SAIS over the years, and I look forward to doing more of that. Today I'm going to talk about the West Belfast Uvf, formed in 1913, early 1913. Covenant had been signed in September 1912, and then the Ulster Unionist Council, as many of you will know, got the UVF going in early 1913. Across Ulster, quite rapidly, it had 90,000 volunteers in various states of dress and arms, but gradually they became formally uniformed and better equipped as guns were obtained, as rifles I should say, were obtained from many different places. And it looked in 1913 that they would quite possibly be involved in some kind of conflict here. It looked like that might be against the British Army if London tried to impose Home Rule on the whole island. It was possible that they could have been facing both the British Army and the National Volunteers, or the Irish Volunteers as they then were, who had enlisted in support of Home Rule in response to the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force. So these men, when they enlisted in 1913 and into 1914, were expecting that they would be involved in some kind of fight. What they couldn't have imagined in 1913 was that they would be involved in a world war, the Great War as it was known early on, and First World War as we came to call it later. Now, I just thought it worth mentioning my personal context. People sometimes think, why is he here with his English accent talking about this stuff? I'll start with the two people on the right who are my grandparents. My grandmother was born in Dromore in County Down in the 1890s. My grandfather, Edward Grayson, was born at Kinnigo, just outside Lurgan. If you know Kinnigo Marina, that marina is built on land that used to be part of the family farm. And Kinnigo House is still there, and I got to go inside it quite recently, which was really interesting. Grandfather Edward served in the Royal Flying Corps and then the Royal Air Force in the First World War. He served in the Home Guard in the Second World War, by which point he was living in Hertfordshire. From the stories he told about that, I came to the conclusion that Dad's Army was not a comedy, but in fact a documentary, because his experiences in the Home Guard seemed to be exactly like Dad's Army. Their main contribution to the British war effort was to accidentally blow up the London to Birmingham railway line, which the Luftwaffe had been trying to hit, but having begun their exercises in the Swan, public house obviously, and then decided it would be a good idea to hit a moving target with Stokes mortar, they hideously overshot and hit the railway line. And the Luftwaffe had never damaged any part of that railway line throughout the whole war, but the Boxmoor Battalion of the Hertfordshire Home Guard managed to do so. In some ways, the man in the largest photo is the most important in all of this, because it's his story that sort of began my interest in researching the First World War. And he was my grandmother's brother. So my grandmother was Maud Powell. Her brother James, known as Jimmy, was killed in the 2nd Royal Irish Rifles in September 1915. Killed at the Battle of Hooge, or at Hooge I should say, which was a diversionary operation for the Battle of Lewes, which was a much bigger offensive, kicking off on that day. I visited his grave for the first time in 1987 and have carried on doing so for many years since. He had two brothers who served. One was Charlie. I'll say a bit more about Charlie later, but for now, I think what's interesting about him is he enlisted underage. So, if you're a Lurgan man wanting to enlist underage, where do you go? You go to Belfast. He ended up serving in the 9th Royal Irish Rifles, so the West Belfast unit of the Royal Irish Rifles, and he was later transferred to the 15th Battalion, North Belfast, and he was captured by the Germans in March 1918 and saw out the rest of the war as a POW. He had another brother, Joe. He was in the 9th Royal Irish Fusiliers. We don't have a photo of him. He went off to Australia in the 30s and died, having been gassed towards the end of the war and never fully recovered. What really links him to this subject is that he was in the 9th Royal Irish Fusiliers because he was a member of the Lurgan Ulster Volunteer Force. And this listing from the local newspaper in Lurgan is of UVF members who joined the Ninth Royal Irish Fusiliers, and it's a page-long list. Unfortunately, we don't have anything like that for the West Belfast UVF, but we do have that for the Lurgan UVF, which is perhaps a story I'll look into at some other point. Academically, I think some of you may know my book Belfast Boys, which came out nearly 10 years ago now, well, 9 years ago, which I have to say started out as I intended it to be solely about the 9th Royal Irish Rifles, because I was interested in their story before I even knew that Great Uncle Charlie had served in that battalion. But I realised that there was a story to tell about both unionism and nationalism. And initially the book then became about the 9th Royal Irish Rifles and the 6th Connaught Rangers, who'd been formed from the National Volunteers. But then I decided to try and tell the story of the whole of West Belfast. And I'd also written specifically about the West Belfast UVF in that book, Remembering 1916, which looks at both how the Somme and the Easter Rising have been remembered in different ways and in similar ways as well. Now, I've started to use the phrase West Belfast a bit, and we all have an idea of what that is now. Many of you will know that the geography was quite different. Orange and green have no significance on this map, they're just marker pens. Pink, however, is worth pointing out first of all. No, actually, I'll do that in a moment. Basically, the orange boundary is what I've defined as West Belfast, and the green lines within it are simply the ward boundaries. Now, the main thing that was different about West Belfast in 1914 was that this pink line, the West Link, simply wasn't there. So, and the result of that was that West Belfast stretched much more into the city centre than it would have once done. You know, you've got terraced housing here who would have considered the people there to be very near neighbours before the West Link. Similarly, because of where people worked, and I did quite a lot of investigation talking to people who remember the city before the West Link went in, areas that we would now consider South Belfast very clearly were much more connected to the west of the city in terms of where people worked and socialised, where they went to school, sports teams they played in, and all the rest of it. And so this area of West Belfast that I was looking at was anybody who lived this side of the Crumlin Road and basically above the railway line here. So it draws in, but it draws in obviously what we think of as West Belfast, but also some other areas. Now that part of the city was quite different in 1914-18. Culture Land, as it now is, was Broadway Presbyterian Church. Why was there a Presbyterian church in the Falls? Because there were Presbyterians there. You look at the religious mix from the 1911 census, nearly 1 in 5 of the population of the Falls was Protestant of some kind, principally Presbyterian, but also Church of Ireland and others. And actually 7% of Shankill Ward was Roman Catholic. And you know, you wouldn't hear often now of something called the Andersonstown UVF, would you? But there was one. There was an Andersonstown UVF because there were unionists there who wanted to join it when Home Rule was being proposed. Now, if you were to try and tell a story of everybody from a local area who served, how would you try and do that? Well, ideally, you'd go through the service records for everybody who served. Fortunately, they're now searchable. When I began this project, they were only available on microfilm. And I thought, well, I wonder how long it would take me to get through all of those that have survived, the whole of the British Army. And I went to the National Archives at Kew, which was the only place you could look at them. I did a day's research and tallied up how many I could get through in a day and worked out how many there were. Roughly 2 million of them have survived. And I worked out that if I could get to the National Archives 5 days a week, which I actually can't because as an academic I have to teach and do all that other stuff, I could do it 5 days a week. It would take me 27 years. So that simply wasn't happening. And I thought, well, that's a shame because that would have been a really good source. It was, however, digitised. And you could then just search for Belfast and you get like 30,000 records come up. And then you just gradually pull out the West Belfast ones. It is a very gradual process. However, that's not the whole story, because having failed to hit the Hemel Hempstead bit of the London to Birmingham railway line, the Luftwaffe did manage to hit the Arnside Street repository in central London, where the First World War records were held. And only about a third of the service records survived. So you're only ever going to be able to find 1/3 of the service records for any part of the UK that you choose to look at. So what do? Well, you have to use a very wide range of other sources. So the newspapers are particularly valuable for Belfast. This won't work everywhere. They're useful in many places, but Belfast is particularly unusual in having had very detailed coverage of ordinary soldiers, not just officers, who served in the First World War. If you look, for example, at the Dublin newspapers, there's much more of a focus on officers and less on the ordinary soldier. You still find useful information, but it's not as detailed as Belfast. So there's newspapers. Ancestry.co.uk, and you can find this stuff and find my past, I believe, as well now, although I prefer the interface using Ancestry. So there's pensions and service records, soldiers and officers died in the Great War, Ireland's memorial records, which were produced by the Free State government in the 20s to cover all those who served in Irish regiments, and medal rolls. The National Archives also has medal rolls, battalion war diaries, officer records, which unfortunately are still all on paper. So you have to plough through those and just do what you can. Commonwealth War Graves Commission website is really valuable. You can just type in Belfast in additional information and it will bring up anyone with any mention of a Belfast address. There's a wills index on CD, that's actually now online with the National Archives of Ireland in Dublin. Memorial rolls, there's a very detailed Presbyterian roll covering all of Belfast and many other places. Parish memorial rolls in this part of the city are less detailed, but St Michael's Church of Ireland does have quite a detailed one with, if I recall, about 350 names on it. Those who served as well as those were killed. There's only one listing that I know of for a whole battalion, everybody who served in a battalion during the war, and that's the 14th Royal Irish Rifles, formed from the young citizens, volunteers of course, and part of the Ulster Division. Just to give you an idea of these sources, Belfast Telegraph is the paper that has the photographs. Soldiers could be reported just for serving, so they don't have to have been killed or wounded or had a medal given to them. They might just have been serving. And it's in these little biographies that you'll find information which says, was a member of the West Belfast Uvf, was a member of the South Belfast Uvf, and so on. Crucially, these pictures have addresses, either their address or their next of kin, and that helps you link them to a specific bit of the city. I used also newsletter and the Irish News. I started using the Northern Whig, but I found that it simply was repeating information I'd already got in all the other newspapers, so I didn't use that systematically day to day. But this material was important for finding out UVF membership. The only other one, other than individual family knowledge, to find out about UVF membership is the records of the Patriotic Fund. So the Patriotic Fund was established early on in the war, initially to support the relatives and particularly widows of UVF members who'd gone into the British Army during the First World War. Later on, during the war, it was linked to the Ulster Division as a whole. So you could get support if you'd been in the Ulster Division but not been a member of the UVF before that. Now, unfortunately, these records are closed. They're held at the Somme Heritage Centre, just outside Newton Ards, and there are a number of reasons why they're closed at the moment, but in particular, they contain sensitive personal data on people who, obviously they are not still alive, but their children might be. And I'm told that there are some quite candid statements about men who'd applied for money. So, for example, we're not giving him any money, he beats his wife. And it's just very difficult to know how to treat that sort of information. However, what they will do, if you think you have a relative who might have applied to the Patriotic Fund, you can ask to see their records and they'll release you basic stuff. And I did that with my grandmother's brothers and struck lucky for two of them. First of all, the one headed UVF Patriotic Fund was an application made in 1924 by Annie Powell, who was the widow of Jimmy, who'd been killed. Now, Jimmy was in the 2nd Royal Irish Rifles, and he'd been serving since the start of the war, so he could have been in the UVF, but he wasn't. And he wasn't in the Ulster Division. And at that point, in 1924, her application for a relatively small amount of money was refused. He didn't have any connection to either the UVF or the Ulster Division. And even though he was dead, she got no support from the Patriotic Fund. However, go forward to the 1970s, early 1970s, and Charlie Powell himself, who was in his 70s himself at this point, applied for money to what was by then, you could see it headed Ulster Division Patriotic Fund. And between then and the mid-1980s, he made something like 14 applications, and they were all successful, for small amounts of money. This record is really interesting because it confirms that he served in the 9th Royal Irish Rifles, then the merged 8th, 9th, and then the 15th. It gives his dates of service, and given that his own service record had not survived, this is a really important record of UVF membership or not, membership of the British Army. At some point, this source needs to be digitised and something needs to be done with it, because I'd say for Ulster's history of the First World War, it's just the hidden gem. So interesting. Anyway, that's the other way of finding out about West Belfast membership of the UVF. Now, having drawn all these sources together, what did I find? First of all, figures for West Belfast as a whole, and I'm talking about the Shankill and the Falls here, and I'll unpick those in a moment. I found around 8,500 who'd served. There's a range because some people show up in different records and they may or may not be the same person, but particularly if there's just an initial, not a full name, that's a real problem. If none of the duplicates are duplicates, then the higher number applies. If all of them are, the lower number applies. In reality, some of them probably are and some aren't. It's roughly 8,500 who served. I found 2002 certainly dead, and another 159 who might be. Commonly, the 159 are people who were reported dead in the newspapers, but then later turned up as prisoners or badly wounded somewhere. There's a man in Belfast City Cemetery, Arthur Hills, who was reported dead on the 1st of July 1916. His officer's letter home to his wife saying what a splendid man he was printed in one of the newspapers. And then a few weeks later, he shows up as a POW. And I only realised this when I found that he was buried in Belfast City Cemetery in 1919, date of death in 1919. And I thought, well, hang on, he's not been killed on the 1st of July 16 if he's buried there. And that was what got me into looking at that. So there could be another 100 or so dead. This is roughly 60% of men from the area aged 18 to 40. Because of the destruction of the records in 1940 in the London Blitz, I estimate that there's probably another 3,500 who served. Nothing remarkable happened to them. We won't ever know what happened to them because the only bit of paper that would have survived would have told us that was destroyed. The population of the Shankill, greater Shankill area, was roughly 3/4 of what I've considered West Belfast at the time, and the Falls was about a quarter. And what's interesting about this is that actually enlistment in the Shankill and the Falls matched the share of the population. So roughly 3/4 of those people are from the Shankill. So we're talking, I'll come on to some specific Shankill figures in a moment. And going into more depth than that, Catholics constituted about 25% of the population of West Belfast, and they were roughly 25% of the recruits. The religious denomination seems to have had very little impact on whether or not you were likely to enlist. Now, looking more specifically at Shankill, where I actually began this project was by some information that was then I saw on a tourist information leaflet that I picked up at Fernhill House when it was open as a museum in the late 1990s, and that actually talked about 760 Shankill men enlisting and only 76 coming back, and I thought that's a 90% fatality rate. That's a tremendous loss, and that was the story initially I wanted to tell. And those figures are still around on the city council in tourist information groups, but they're saying 760 Shankill men enlisted, but I found well over 6,000 who enlisted. So this is only a very partial part of the story. Where's it come from? And also, Shankill doesn't lose 700 men, it loses twice that number. You know, the scale of service is much higher than the tourist information would suggest, and the scale of the numbers killed are twice as high. The percentages are different though, because many more people return. Where it seems to have come from is the memoirs of Frank Crozier, the commander of the 9th Battalion of the Royal Irish Rifles, who wrote that on the 3rd of July 1916, of his original 760 men, only 76 remained standing, the rest were casualties. Well, they probably were, but casualties is not the same as fatalities. In fact, that battalion had around 100 dead that day, not 700, and again, that's still a huge number, but it's different to that story that gets told. I have talked to the City Council about trying to update those figures to recognise the huge scope. And these boards, it turns out, cost thousands and thousands of pounds. So at some point when it comes to renew them, hopefully it might be updated. However, it's worth noting that even though the sort of level of fatalities compared to those who served is lower than we might think, and the number of dead on the 1st of July 1916 is lower than we might think. The Somme is still a really, really devastating blow for the Shankill, and it's just no surprise to me at all that this is what people would focus on, because 173 dead, I reckon, from the Shankill. If you take that as a percentage of the Shankill's dead across the war, that's over 1 in 10. Nearly 13% of the Shankill's dead come on just 2 days of the war. 2 days of the war and 0.1% of the days of the war. There are well over 1,000 days in the war, and the Shankill loses over 1 in 10 of its dead on just 2 of them. So that explains, and I think justifies, why there is so much attention to the Somme here. But if it's the case that so many more people served than we think, and they weren't all killed on the 1st of July 1916 and the 2nd of July, where were they serving? And this is what leads into what I think is one of the really interesting things about a sort of lost and forgotten history of the Ulster Volunteer Force from West Belfast. I'll come on to that in a moment. But first of all, just look at this table. Now, actually here, orange and green do mean something here. So orange is battalions of the Ulster Division. Green is battalions of the 16th Irish Division. And black is something else, which I'll explain in a moment. First of all, these numbers don't even remotely add up to 8,500. That's because often we know that someone served in the Royal Irish Rifles, but we don't know which battalion. And that has a huge effect on which type of unit they're with. But I'm just going to move this ever so slightly, just so we get that number there. Yeah, there we go. So, when you know which units men serve, it's obviously no surprise that the 9th Royal Irish Rifles, formed directly from the West Belfast Uvf, has more men in it than any other unit from this part of the city, because that's what the Uvf went into. And I managed to identify over 500 of them. There's also a lot of men going directly in from the UVF into the non-infantry units of the 36th Division. Particularly, if they had a skill, then they would often go into the Royal Engineers, where that skill would be used. The 14th Royal Irish Rifles and the 15th Royal Irish Rifles attract a lot. The reason the 15th attract a lot is because then, as now, the boundary between West and North Belfast runs up the middle of the Shankill Road. So there are places going up the Shankill Road on the right that, in terms of UVF organisation then and parliamentary organisation, is all part of North Belfast rather than West Belfast. All the other units are in the Ulster Division, so there is a real dominance of the Ulster Division. Connaught Rangers and the Leinsters are almost entirely recruited in the Force. But you've then got the units in black. Now, what's really interesting about this is that a lot of the units recruiting very heavily are the 2nd and 1st battalions of infantry regiments. Now, the 2nd and 1st battalions consist of two sorts of soldiers. First of all, regular soldiers, men who are already serving when war breaks out. The Shankill in 1914 had produced a lot of regular soldiers. There was a tradition of being in the British Army, and so you already had men who were in it, some of them in India, when war broke out. They were brought back quite rapidly to the Western Front. The other types of men who were serving were the reservists. Now, some of them would be former soldiers, and some of them would just be men who wanted to be in the equivalent of today's territorial army. And one of the points there is that there is a crossover between membership of the Ulster Volunteer Force and, in fact, the Irish Volunteers, and being a reservist. one of the things that would make you join the UVF or the Irish Volunteers was that you were interested in military type activities. And if you were interested in military type activities, the chances were you probably already joined the reservists. And of course those men who were reservists would rise quite rapidly. They would be the sergeants and the corporals in both the UVF and the Irish Volunteers prior to the First World War. So that's the first and second units, and they'll first Royal Irish Fusiliers, first Irish Guards, taller men were in the Irish Guards, as with all British Army Guards regiments. Belfast having a naval tradition as well, being on the coast, obviously being a port. You've got HMS Hawke, which was one of the early casualties of the war. Had a large number of men on as well. A couple of other units though, 6th Royal Irish Rifles, 6th Royal Irish Fusiliers, 5th Royal Irish Fusiliers. They are all part of the 10th Irish Division. The 10th Irish Division is the first division formed on the island at the outbreak of war, and it's not political. It's not political in the way that Carson is recruiting for the 36th Division and Redmond is recruiting a little bit later for the 16th Division. But it exists before either of those divisions. So if you are a member of the UVF who wants to enlist and you're not a regular or a reservist, what are you going to do? Well, actually some people would have family connections with a particular regiment. So there's the group of men in the Shankill who join the South Lancashire Regiment. They get on a boat, they go and enlist in England. But others just want to join the Royal Irish Rifles as quickly as they can, and they don't want to wait about Carson and the big house unionists to get the Ulster Division formed. They just go and enlist, and they get put in the 10th Irish Division. Now the effect of this, the effect of the regulars and the reservists being in the 1st and 2nd unit, 1st and 2nd battalions of the Royal Irish Rifles, the Enniskillens and the Royal Irish Fusiliers, and also UVF men joining the 10th Division rapidly, is there's some mixing of people who've been in those paramilitary groups. So you find reservists from the UVF and the Irish Volunteers suddenly thrown in together in, say, the 2nd Royal Irish Rifles, and they put their differences behind them on the front because it's the Germans who are shooting at them. The Germans are the danger, and so that's one of the things that I think is left out of the story. Now, I said that it's I think very understandable that the Somme and the 36th Division are absolutely central to here, and the way that the war is commemorated. Keith Jeffrey, the late Keith Jeffrey, actually went a bit further than just talking about UVF enlistment and said that the 36th Division is the closest that Ulster has to a PALS formation. So in the north of England it was very common for groups of friends just to go and join up together, and nobody had thought at this stage of the devastating effect that could have on the community if there were heavy losses, and it's not something that's repeated in the Second World War for that reason. But it is like a PALS formation, and we've got to remember that the 36th Division is formed from the UVF. That's how it begins. They take units of the West Belfast Uvf and put them in the 9th Royal Irish Rifles, units of the East Belfast go into the 8th, and so on. It happens across Ulster. But the story of what happens to UVF men during the war is a bit more complicated than that because of the reservists, other enlistments due to circumstances. I haven't mentioned that yet. Linen mills in West Belfast. As soon as war breaks out, they lose continental orders. So what do the men do? They join the army. That's something that people have done before when there was no work. So economic factors are there. We've also got to remember that the Ulster Division was not fully complete at the end of 1914, and so the artillery, for example, comes in from London. Specifically, there are artillery units from Croydon in South London, which go into the Ulster Division. And they've got no idea what Home Rule is about and whether they're for or against it. That's not why they've enlisted. So even from an early stage, I think it's important to recognise the sort of UK-wide dimension of the Ulster Division, as well as the specifically unionist circumstances. But we have got, this is a picture of a mural that, not far from here, is now gone, but I took that photo in 2005, and the story has been very much of, this says West Belfast Ulster Volunteer Force training at Glencairn in 1913, then the West Belfast Uvf, 9th Royal Irish Rifles, goes over the top of the Somme, and then we come up to 69, and then 2000. But there's this strong story that you can certainly still see around the place, throughout the city, that the UVF becomes the Ulster Division. Well, the UVF certainly does become the Ulster Division, but not all the UVF does, because some of the UVF go to many other places. And if we're to really appreciate the full story of the UVF service in the First World War, we need to understand, I think, the diversity of that. And I've got a few stories and some numbers. So, a couple of years ago now, for the first time, I did a walking tour that the Living Legacy Centre organised around West Belfast. We actually started out in Culture Lab and walked through to the Shankill. And the idea of that was to sort of think about how the geography of 1418 was a little bit different. And also to think about how the UVF story is not only about the Somme, it's about some other things. So these two examples are interesting. Frank Todd, First Royal Irish Fusiliers, he was born in Portsdown, but he was living in March Street at the outbreak of war. He was a member of the West Belfast Uvf. He's the first member of the UVF from or living in West Belfast to be killed in the war. The first one, and he's in the First Royal Irish Fusiliers, and he's killed in October 1914. So that's in the very early stages of the war. The war is still mobile. And the story of somebody like Frank Todd would not be fully appreciated if we only looked at the Somme. The last member of the UVF living in what I defined as West Belfast, although this is peripheral, very much peripheral now, and you can see that he then was in the South Belfast UVF. He was killed in August 1918, serving in the 16th Royal Scots. So he's a good example of the case I was mentioning earlier, of somebody from here who would maybe have a family connection to an English regiment or a Scottish regiment and would want to go and serve with them. Perhaps some of their parents, perhaps their father was in it, or something else. If we look at it across the board, now, because it is hard to know who in West Belfast was in the UVF at this time, I've only been able to definitively identify 138 men. Now, there were many more than that. We'll certainly go up to 1,000 and say they enlisted. But they do serve, I think, as a sample. You know, they're an illustration of the range of service that these men had. 85 of them, just over 60%, were definitely in the Ulster Division. And the largest single number of those were in the 9th Royal Irish Rifles. This could easily mean that at least half the 9th Royal Irish Rifles were ex-UVF. I think that's very, very likely. So you've got this idea of, hundreds of men with this UVF background going into one battalion and serving together and training together, going through the war, and then some of them returning afterwards. But if you look at that, there's 28 of those were dead. There's a date of death for them. Only 4 of them, actually, of that cohort, were on the 1st of July 1916. Some had been killed before that, 15 of them, 1 a week later, and 8 in 1917, I think almost entirely at Passchendaele. So there's a complex story there. West Belfast Uvf men in the 9th Royal Irish Rifles were being killed even before the Battle of the Somme had begun. 21 were in other infantry battalions and 5 were in the non-infantry units. Machine Gun Corps, Royal Army Medical Corps, Royal Engineers, Army Service Corps and trench mortar batteries. Where else were they? Well, 8 of them, just very hard to tell. I just can't work out exactly where they were serving. I know, for example, they were in the Royal Irish Rifles, but were they in the 9th and in the 36th Division, or were they in the 6th and serving in the 10th Division? We just don't know. We're not going to. If they were all in the Ulster Division, then we could say that around 2/3 of the UVF men were in the Ulster Division, but that leaves about 1/3 who were never in the Ulster Division from this sample of UVF men. The largest single number of them, 30 out of 45, were in regular battalions. We don't know if they were regulars or reservists, but they were in the regular battalions, and by far the largest number, or 1/3 of that 30, is in the 2nd Royal Irish Rifles. Then you've got many in the Skillings, Irish Fusiliers, Irish Guards, and actually one man served in both the 1st and the 2nd Royal Irish Rifles. Possibly more did that, but that's what I can verify. The other 15 are quite interesting, I think, because if you have a narrative that just says, well, the UVF joined up and went into the Ulster Division, these are the people you really miss out. 6 of them were in the 10th Irish Division. So these men, just slide to this. Yeah. These men first see action at Gallipoli. It would be really interesting, I think, to see a mural in the Shankill that talks about Gallipoli. It's a different bit of the war, it's a bit we don't talk about. It's where UVF men who were volunteers were among the first in action. But it's subsumed in the story of the song. That's 6 of them, and they were all in the 6th Royal Irish Rifles, so there's a group of them together. And as this is only a sample, we might be talking of 50, 60, 70 men, ex-UVF, in the 6th Royal Irish Rifles at Gallipoli in August 1915. 7 are in a range of other units, English and Scottish regiments, Canadian Army, the Military Mounted Police, and others. 1 is in the Royal Field Artillery, and I don't know which bit, but it's not a bit that was in the Ulster Division. And then 1 of them, this is a curious one, a man called Isaac Hughes. He was an early UVF enlister and went into the 10th Irish Division. As part of the 6th Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers, but he was wounded and he was home for a while. And when he's redeployed, he's put in the 8th Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers. Now, the 8th Enniskillen Fusiliers are in the 16th Irish Division. The 16th Irish Division is the Nationalist Division recruited by John Redmond. So he may be the only example, but you have 1 example there of an ex-UVF man serving in the Nationalist Division. Just who knows how that happened. The story I think of is that probably an English sergeant, well, you're still in the Enniskillens, aren't you? What does it matter? And that's how it happened. but it's an interesting story. What are we to make of all of this? As I said a number of times, it's really important, I think, that the Somme is commemorated in the way that it is, that the Ulster Division on the 1st of July, that their story is told. But to not tell in quite the same way the story of perhaps a third of the people who were serving, I just think misses out a really important part of a complicated history. And that's one of the great things I think about this project going on here, is that actually you're getting lots of stories that fit a certain pattern of service, but you also get really unusual details cropping up, which show that that's not the only story. And these facts, because they haven't been told in the popular history over years and years, the only place we can find them is actually in people's attics, in their drawers, the medals that people have, the pictures they have at home. And so my hope is that this project can just develop and we can find even more of these facts, which will tell us about odd cases like Isaac Hughes, which maybe just tell us that history is not quite as simple as we've always thought it was. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. I hadn't heard that before. I know you said some of the ones probably had, but I'm sure there's bits that they would have picked up on. Thanks for coming over. Thanks for joining us at the part of our lunch. And just like to present you, this was a book that was produced last year by the Spectrum.
Yeah.
It was a copy. Yeah, it's a copy. So we'd like to present you with a copy of it.
Thank you.
Give you something to read on the way home.